I bought her. Thank you so much for being here, y'all.
So thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Ro Kelly. I am a bookseller here at Left Bank, and I, along with our whole team, welcome you to this special event. Tonight, we welcome Joanna Dee to discuss her newest book, Faith, Family, and Flag, Branson Entertainment and the Idea of America. And to keep the conversation going, we welcome Will Bonfiglio as Joanna's conversation partner. And some notes before we begin. Today's event is possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the local economy, and it helps writers get the support that they deserve by allowing us to produce events like this. So thank you all for shopping local and for being here tonight. We at Left Bank are always working to plan new events for readers of all kinds. So on Thursday, if you're interested, we are partnering with the Schlafly Public Library down the street, and we are welcoming Susan Orlean, who is the author of The Orchid Thief. And yeah, she's got a new book called Joyride. So that is on Thursday, if you're interested in that. And then on Tuesday, next week, on the 25th, you can join us at the COCA to celebrate the success of COCA Distinguished Alumni Lauren Morrow and Joanna Dee. And they're going to share their inspiring journeys from dancers to published authors. There will be a lively conversation followed by a book signing and reception with little bites and drinks. So if either of those sound compelling to you, please join us at those off-site events. And if they don't, please check out our event calendar because we have all kinds of events. So there's something that will interest you for sure. And for tonight's event, Joanna Dee is an associate professor of performing arts at Washington University in St. Louis. She is the author of the award-winning book, Katherine Dunham, Dance and the African Diaspora. And Will Bonfiglio is a graduate of Washington University's program in theater and performing studies. He has taught in the American Culture Studies at WashU and the Performing Arts Department. And as a theater artist, his creative work has been presented across the country. So for tonight's book, Faith, Family, and Flag, Branson Entertainment and the Idea of America, this book is a comprehensive history of the Branson entertainment industry within the context of America's long culture wars. Joanna reveals how and why a town known for its popular entertainment, a domain associated most often with the political left, actually came to be so important to the political right and its visions for America. So this book is timely, it is complex, and it provides insight into the history and significance of our beloved Branson. So thank you for listening to me for so long. Without further ado, while you're actually all here, let's give a warm welcome to Joanna Dee and Will Bonfiglio.
Sure. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. What we're going to do today is I'm going to start off, I'll maybe stand up. So I'm going to start off by reading just the first page of my book and then talking a little bit about an overview of what's in the book. And then Will and I are going to have a conversation, and then we'd love to hear your questions and have a conversation with you all. So the first page, I'll start with some quotes. Branson is a God-blessed area. Randy Plummer, Branson performer. Branson is as close to hell as anything I've seen in my life. Joe Queenan, journalist. If you want to understand the tourist mecca of Branson, Missouri, you have to understand the Shoji Tabuchi Theater. Shut your eyes and imagine this faded, abandoned building as it was in its 1990s heyday, when a full mile of purple, pink, and green neon lined the Art Deco exterior and the giant letters SHOJI glittered above the entrance. Twice a day, 6 days a week, 40 weeks of the year, thousands of people from across the United States packed in to see the Shoji Tabuchi show, a fast-paced cornucopia of Broadway song and dance numbers, country music hits, pop medleys, jokes about Japanese people eating bait, performers in cow costumes, a girl flying on top of a magic carpet, a gospel choir, and a rousing rendition of America the Beautiful. And then there were the restrooms, purported to cost $1 million each. where photography was encouraged. If you forgot your camera, you could buy a postcard of them in the gift shop. Over on the men's side, patrons could play billiards while waiting to sit on black porcelain toilets imported from Italy. On the women's side, fresh orchids adorned granite and onyx pedal sinks below gilded mirrors. Purple crystals in the chandelier cast violet hues upon the red and green wallpaper featuring cherubs. Visitors called the bathrooms amazing, stunning, unbelievable, and, quote, a destination in their own right. But East Coast cultural critics recoiled. They saw Tabucci's toilets as they saw the city's entertainment industry overall. Tacky, gaudy glitz trying to cover up crap. So your opinion on Branson is kind of a litmus test of where you stand in America's culture wars. But what I tried to do in this book, rather than take a side in those culture wars, is historicize the culture wars, explain the phenomenon of Branson, how it has developed historically over time, and where it might be going today. I believe that Branson is one of the most important destinations for live performance in America. First, you think of New York City with Broadway, then you might think of Las Vegas or Chicago, and then I think of Branson. More than 10 million people visit there a year. During its 1990s and early 2000s heyday, Branson had more theater seats than Broadway. For several of those years, it was the second most popular car destination in the United States, behind Disney World. And while today people go to Branson for a variety of reasons, including boating, fishing, and mini golf, a big part of that draw is still live performance. So just last year, for example, in 2024, there were 89 shows running in Branson, 9 months of the year, and another 21 at Christmas time. By comparison, Broadway had 34 shows that were running that year. These are variety shows, country music reviews, magic shows, and Bible-based musicals. But despite that importance, the national media has either overlooked or mocked Branson, and scholars have not done much better. Cultural critics have been particularly cruel to this tourist haven, calling it, in addition to the quote I read, the elephant's graveyard of entertainment, town of the living dead, and the living mausoleum. So my first job, I feel, is to correct the record. I think of Branson is very important to the history of American culture, and far from being a living mausoleum, it's a place that over the decades has included several brilliant performers who have kept alive vital American theatrical traditions. But I couldn't just write that book. I felt like the story of Branson couldn't fully be understood unless we understood the mockery. Where does that come from? My argument in the book is that the value system that Branson Entertainment has promoted throughout the city has placed it into the crosshairs of America's culture wars for over a century. So I feel like we can't understand the vast discrepancy between Branson's importance and the lack of recognition of that importance without understanding these political battles into which it and American culture has been situated. And what is that value system as communicated through performance? Everyone I talked to in Branson over the course of my many years of research and writing in this book, which also included lots of digging in archives, interviewing dozens of performers, witnessing live shows, also amassed my own personal archive through eBay of every show I could find historically, VHS tapes, even LP records from some of the early 60s and 70s shows. But everyone I talked to mentioned the 3 F's. It's the town's motto, spoken by the mayor and other public figures. It's right now on the Convention and Visitors Bureau's website. It is a guideline for what every Branson show should be grounded in, regardless of whether it's a magic show, a country music review, an Elvis tribute, or a musical. And a Bransonite show expresses faith, family, and flag. For Branson's marketing team, these 3 F's are universal values. They're apolitical or pre-political, right? Values that welcome everyone. As Bob McGill, author of Branson's Entertainment Pioneers, wrote, quote, the town was built on the themes of God, patriotism, and family. And again, in reasserting the universalism, wrote, God, patriotism, and family are themes that touch the souls of all men everywhere. The issue with that universalism is that the 3 F's have also a lengthy association with a particular political orientation, conservatism. The phrase faith, family, and freedom, which is kind of a variation on faith, family, and flag. Sometimes faith, family, and freedom is the other variation. It was trademarked in 1989 by Gary Bauer, then president of the Family Research Council, an evangelical Christian lobbying group that has consistently worked to support conservative candidates for political office. In 1997, Adam Meyerson, vice president of the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, wrote, quote, Family, Faith, Freedom, a manifesto for cultural renewal, in which he declared that, quote, this is conservatism's cultural moment. Now is the time for conservative cultural ideas, marriage, religion, civil society to repair the fabric of American life. And many political candidates have used that slogan. And more recently, there's been a resurgence of the phrase after the death of conservative political activist Charlie Kirk. On September 10th, 2025, R.R. Reno, editor of the influential religious journal First Things, wrote, Kirk was right, and we should not be shy about saying so. As many of us feel in our bones, we are at a turning point. Many, and I count myself among them, don't like the American society created by open borders, multicultural ideology, LGBT advocates, and Black Lives Matter. We want a society anchored in faith, family, and flag. So in a sense, my book rests on this very tension. Branson has grounded itself in a value system, faith, family, and flag, that millions of people, including many in Branson, genuinely believe is the foundation of our nation, the foundation of our American dream, and universal and pre-political. But for millions of others, that mantra is against their idea of a pluralistic, inclusive, multi-ethnic democracy that they think is the foundation of America. And I look at how live performance in Branson has played a role in the battle over the meanings of these terms, and therefore also the battle over the meaning of America as a cultural and political project. So I organized this book according to the 3 F's, but I added several of my own. I started with foundation, looking at the roots of the Branson entertainment industry in the early 20th century. I then have a chapter called Folk and Frontier, which are also very important concepts to Branson. Then family, then I added an F of free enterprise because individual business ownership is also very central to Branson and its American dream. And then faith, flag, and finally future. And I can't predict the future, but I speculate on 3 possible directions Branson could go in. And finally, there's an epilogue where I let down my scholarly guard a little bit to talk about what it was like to write a book historicizing the culture wars, while also being drafted into the culture wars, whether I liked it or not, by virtue of being an academic at an institution of higher education. And so it made writing the book a challenge in trying to not take a side in the culture war and trying to not write a book that was polemical, but led with curiosity. And so I'd like to now transition to a conversation with Will to talk further about the book. And I'd also like to ask him about his own memories of visiting Branson as well.
Thank you. Yeah, the book's great. Yeah, I'm so glad to see like a good crowd. But yeah, my own memories of Branson, I think, is one of the things that I was being reminded of while reading the book, and I don't know if it was by unconsciously or not, like I had suppressed a lot of my Branson memories. And so it dawned on me that I was like, wow, okay, I was there a few times, and I remembered like going when I was growing up in kind of like the mid to late 90s. I was there kind of in the heyday, as you mentioned, especially during the holidays. And I think about the community aspect of it, and which you get at really with this idea of faith, especially at the holidays, it's even more pronounced, right? And so I think there's a lot of that came to mind when I was reading the book. Yeah. And so it tracks. I was like, okay, she's diagnosing it right, adding the other F's. I'm like, okay, I think she's onto something. But then when we were chatting, one of the first questions, that I asked you was, I was like, well, why Branson? Like, what made you want to write about Branson?
Sure. So what I'd always known about Branson growing up in St. Louis, and many of my dance teachers at Coca had performed in Branson. And then in 2006, I was in grad school at NYU, and I do not remember why Branson popped into my head as a response, but it did. It was in the wake of the 2004 election. Democrats felt in the wilderness. They had lost the presidency, the House, the Senate. And this guy, Thomas Frank, wrote this best-selling book called What's the Matter with Kansas? Did anyone read that book? Remember that book? I checked it out. Yeah. And he had this thesis that has kind of become quite popular in many ways, in which he argued that middle Americans vote with their cultural interests, but against their economic and social interests. And what popped into my head was that's not true. in Branson, all of these things align. And I can't remember why I thought about that, but I did. And but I left it aside for about 10 years. And then I moved back to Missouri in 2016 to take a job at WashU. And the 2016 election happened, and I heard the same rhetoric all over again. And I said, you know, again, that's not true in Branson. These ideas weave together really nicely in performance. And that's a part of what live performance can do. It can take different ideas and put them together into a kind of coherent whole, like a vision for the world that you can see on the stage. And I also felt that in academia, again, no one had written about Branson. It's a really important place of live performance where millions of people go every year and have done for decades. And I felt that scholars were kind of scared of it because of its political leanings. And I felt it was just very important to write about and also just establish historically like the different performance traditions that Branson has kept alive that are pretty vibrant and important to American popular culture.
One of the other things that, for those of you, you know, when you get the book, the appendix is really interesting because you kind of do the historical work of creating a full, I mean, as complete as you can make one of like all of the Branson shows and things that have been happening in the different theaters. And I was really surprised by that when reading it because there were so many names and people and types of shows that you're like, wow, I can't believe this played there. I don't know. And so it really changed my kind of preconceived ideas of it. And I think the two quotes you place at the front are interesting because I found in my time, you know, like most folks do have a pretty polarizing opinion of Branson. And so one thing I'm very curious about is like what in your research in all of the trips you've taken to go visit Branson, like what surprised you about Branson or performance in Branson if you know something stands out?
Yeah, well, it's, you know, one of the things that sticks out is I did a lot of my research during the pandemic. And if for those of you who can remember, were involved with theater at that time, theater everywhere was shut down, right? Everywhere was shut down. People were worried, would theater ever come back? Would live performance ever come back? And in the middle of it, also, there was this letter, you probably remember this, said, "We see you, white American theater," in which many Black theater artists challenged American regional theater, national theater, and said, you aren't actually living up to your progressive ideals. So there was this sense in the theater world of like, do we actually have a purpose? Are we actually doing anything? We think we're doing this politically progressive work. Maybe we're not even. And is anyone going to come back to the theater? And I went down to Branson, which opened up 8 weeks after the shutdown, right? So Broadway stayed closed for over a year. Many regional theaters stayed closed for like 15 months. Branson was open after 8 weeks. And people were like, yeah, theater can change your life. And I was actually jealous. I was surprised to feel so jealous or envious that people had a lot of confidence that theater could change your life, that it could change the world. And I found that very inspiring. And at that moment, it felt surprising because I was living in this other world where like theater was going down the tubes.
Yeah, well, and that's interesting that you say that because I think, you know, you also at the beginning mentioned, you know, the toilets and like the different types of variety show that you're seeing at the shows theater. And I wonder, like, what do you make of that, of this idea of inspiring, you know, where it can change the world? Like, were you able at all to like pinpoint what that is, or is there like a certain quality or something about it? Because you do a nice job in the book of really describing all the different types of variety shows. And I mean, there are acts that I never even thought about being in a show, but I'm like, sure, add that in, right? And so yeah, like I don't know, what is there, or if you had to like place a you know, a stake on what you think that is that makes it so inspiring in the context of Branson? Like, do you have an idea?
Sure, yeah. I think it does what theater says it wants to do all the time, but sometimes fails at, which is create community. The Branson performers go above and beyond to make you feel welcome in the theater. You're free to take pictures, right? Because there isn't this idea that this is my precious original artwork that you can't steal, right? They're more like, no, take pictures, have fun, you're on vacation. people talk to you, the performers will come and talk to you at intermission while they're still in costume, which again is like a no-no in other theaters because you're supposed to like stay in character. They'll stay after the show the whole time. They interact with the audience, they banter with them. And just the rhetoric and the music and everything is really all about creating this kind of beautiful community together. And I think that's very powerful, and that's what a lot of theater aspires to do. And I also think because there's a heavily Christian element too, a lot of the theaters emphasize that, and there's a kind of sense of community in that way, also a religious community. Some shows more pronounced than others, but that's another aspect that I think, really creates that sense.
And I will say based on my experience with Branson, I agree, because when one of the things that I was recalling when I was reading it was I was like maybe that happened, but I was like I think I was like sitting on the stage of like the Andy Williams show, being given like I don't know a candy cane or a
Right.
And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is like the formula at work. And it like was enacted upon me and I forgot it. And then your book brought it back out. But I do think there is that idea of like truly not only breaking the fourth wall, but like there is no fourth wall oftentimes at Branson. And I think what you just said about the idea of like, oh, we need to put on a show and you have to believe I'm this character. So like I don't come out at intermission. I don't come out in costume ever. But here it's like at intermission, they're like signing autographs and like taking pictures, and be like, oh, I gotta get back on the stage. So I do think that's really interesting, and I think that is something so unique to Branson itself.
Well, yeah, what you're mentioning, your story reminds me of another aspect of this is children. Children are welcome at all Branson shows, and I brought my kids to Branson. They had a great time, right? And some, theater tries to be child friendly sometimes, but generally, most of the times it isn't. And in Branson, it genuinely has shows that are designed to entertain grandparents down to grandchildren. And children get to come on stage in many of the shows, right? Like someone's picked to come on stage to participate in things. And that's another aspect that makes Branson so welcoming for so many families who feel shut out or not welcome in other parts of American culture, and especially kind of some urban areas that can be very anti-children.
And I think that is a really good point, because it is so multi-generational, and it truly is thinking about the sense of like, there's no really risk in the show you're going to see. It's like, I can assume that this will be fine for my family. What do you make of, one of the other things is like, there are all these other attractions and things happening that aren't just necessarily like your typical show, but something we'd call maybe a performance or an attraction. But like, how have you seen the strip of Branson evolve over time to shift from like different types of shows, different types of attractions? Like what has the kind of pipeline been over the years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, there's a main drag in Branson, which is a Highway 76. And people started calling it the Branson Strip after the Vegas Strip. Some people in Branson didn't like that because they didn't want the Vegas association, but it stuck, right? Because it is what it is. It's like, it is a carnival midway. It's it's a string of theaters, right? So it used to be very, very full of theaters, and now it's more diversified. Some of the theaters have been turned into kind of attraction places, like Wonderworks, there's an upside down house. Ripley's Believe It or Not. What?
Titanic.
Oh, the Titanic attraction, which is, you get assigned to be like a person on the Titanic and you walk through. The other developments have been, ones that have caused a lot of tension in Branson. Now on the main strip, the main drag, in between theaters are the Dixie Outfitters, which is like a store that sells Confederate paraphernalia. And there's also a Trump store. And so that has caused a lot of friction in Branson. There have been protests and counter protests at the Dixie Outfitters store. So, and that's caused a lot of tension again with Branson's attempt to market itself is for everybody and welcoming everyone, because obviously those stores don't welcome everybody. And so that's been but they also believe in free enterprise. There's no like legal mechanism, to try to not have, they're very open about zoning laws, for example, right? Like they don't have very strict zoning laws in Branson, so there's no way to not, like some people talked about, like, could we just figure out some way to zone so that like a store couldn't be there? And they said, no, you know. So yeah, so that's how the strip has changed. It's fewer theaters and more attractions and these other stores mixed in with the theaters now.
And when you, like, the free enterprise is interesting, because I think as a researcher, like, you have to also be participating a bit in that, and carrying that. And so one of the things I'm very interested in is like, how did you approach putting this book together in terms of your research? I find it interesting because it is not far from us. So it's like, you know, it's kind of, oh, go study our own backyard. But like, what type of pieces did you find like super useful as you were putting the book together? Were there certain archives or attractions or shows that made you kind of realize this is a thing that it could be?
Yeah, well, I did a lot of archival research, mostly in newspapers. I went down to the White River Valley Historical Society and went through newspapers. Also, newspapers.com is a massive digital archive now. It's incredible. So the Springfield newspapers reported a lot on Branson Entertainment. They're great. And then you could also see what the scope was of the national reporting on Branson, especially during its 1990s heyday. And then there is a small archive at the museum of the shows, of like pamphlets and stuff from the shows. What is interesting is that it is all promotional. There aren't theater critics in Branson per se who kind of write kind of critically of the shows. Like everything is marketing, everything is promotion. So that's interesting to try to wade through. And then, yeah, as I said, I went on eBay to try to get every old recording of every show I could find. I went to see lots and lots of live performances. I interviewed dozens of performers, and they were all very open to being interviewed because Branson's ethos is one of hospitality, right? So even though there was some wariness, because again, I didn't want to repeat, and they didn't want me to repeat the trope of kind of like the liberal academic coming in. So I tried to just be as open as possible, and they were quite gracious in being interviewed.
Were there any favorite exhibits or attractions or shows that you saw? Like, if if they say the goal of theater, it can change lives, right? Like, was your life changed by a show that we should all go see?
Yeah. I found several shows quite fascinating. One of my favorites is this show called Sons of Britches. And it's these three men who perform in this little theater inside a kind of IMAX entertainment complex, not kind of your typical grand stage, but they will play any song you ask them to. And it's amazing. It's really amazing. One's on the bass, the other's on the violin, the other mostly sings, but they all play, and it's really remarkable. And oftentimes, one of the reasons Branson can get a bad rap is that, when we have these kind of ideas of art, what counts as art versus entertainment, what gets something elevated to art is originality, right? That's a big factor. And in Branson, everyone plays covers. There's very little original music. But I think it's incredibly original and creative how well they can just jump on a song, make it their own on the spot. It's an incredible feat of improvisation. Going to the other end of the scale, Sight and Sound theaters. Has anyone here been to a Sight and Sound show? I see some nods, yeah. Is a relatively newer theater in Branson, opened in 2006. When they started building it. And it's a theater that produces original Bible-based musicals. The stage is 300 feet wrapped around you. By comparison, a Broadway stage is 38 feet. So think of something that's 10 times as big, right? Their cast sizes are over 50 people. There's live animals involved because they really try to immerse you in the world. And all of the shows they've done have come most of the shows have come from the Old Testament. And they really try to immerse you in this world with incredible costumes, sets, etc. So there isn't a live orchestra, which is very interesting. And I think that has to do with Branson is a very there are no performing unions in town. And musicians generally have a pretty strong union, like pit orchestras do. But those shows are also quite spectacular and really make you think.
I think you get at a point too, which is like the talent, right? Like there is, even if they are playing covers, there's a certain artistry or musicianship that like you can't discount, right? Even though some critics try to say it might not be high art or something like that. But I do think it also, the amount of tribute shows makes me think a lot about how as a society we love nostalgia. We like to kind of rewatch our same shows that we're streaming, or it's like I might just have that on in the background. So I do think there is a market there that they're tapping into as well, right?
Yeah, nostalgia is another term like faith, family, and flag that gets fought over, I feel. Because on the one hand, we all have nostalgia. It's not a negative or a positive emotion. Like, I'm sure I could ask any one of you, what do you feel nostalgic about? And you would have an answer. And so nostalgia is just a human feeling. But in the 1990s, when Branson became nationally well known, after the 60 Minutes piece happened in 1992, Branson kind of exploded in popularity, and its brand is nostalgia. But that was precisely at the moment that many scholars, many historians began criticizing nostalgia. That nostalgia is fake history, that your nostalgia, make America great again, right? There was this kind of large critique of nostalgia as supporting a particular political project. And, it caused a lot of kind of consternation in Branson because on the one hand, like, what's wrong with nostalgia, right? And on the other hand, there are people coming in and saying, you're doing fake history kind of thing. So that's another term that kind of gets tossed around. But it's also not that dissimilar from musical theater, which is also based on nostalgia.
Right, and the idea of I think, what the world we're living in and the world we want to be in, I think that does get at this idea of faith, family, flag as well. And as we, in the book, you mention a lot about how at the end of the day, these people are just trying to like make their livelihood, right, or make their lives. And I think it's a really interesting job you do of stating the history and finding the history, and not really, taking any sort of sides in this culture war, but showing us the history of the culture war and how it transcended from live performance to, when Branson went through its phase of like outdoor attractions and trying to become more of like an outdoor, shopping mecca, and then moving now into more of these like big theatrical projects like the spectacle you mentioned of Sight and Sound, or even the different types of shows that are now happening today.
Yeah. Well, we do want to have time for some audience questions. I'd love to hear your questions, thoughts.
How long did it take you to write the book?
It took me 7 years. Yeah.
So something I'm curious about is with oftentimes when you have something like an entertainment industry, you have the like seedy underbelly. Did you find any of that in Branson?
Well, I did find, it's kind of like, what's the difference between a hustler and a grifter, right? So there are people who really hustle in Branson, like they have their dream, and then there are people who kind of almost cynically like latch on to the faith, family, and flag brand. And I think in any, as you said, in any entertainment industry, you're going to have both, right? So, when I interviewed people in Branson, there was no discussion of that. But, one example is many workers are severely underpaid. There's a housing shortage. This is well before the current housing shortage, starting in the 1990s. Performers, but more importantly, like the concession stand workers, the janitors, the people who worked in the theaters, living in motels, living in campsites, not being able to afford housing. So there's that aspect, right? The attempts at unionization in the early 90s that failed, things like that. So that's one aspect. And, there were, of course, people who were hypocritical as humans are, right? I won't mention the performer's name, but I interviewed some backup dancers, right? And they're like, this performer went on stage and proclaimed his, what a great Christian he was, and he came backstage and snorted coke. right? Or, another one who's like, did a Sunday morning show service and then like groped her. So, that's true everywhere. So that's not unique to Branson. It's a little more, when your brand is wholesomeness and your brand is family values, those things can get even more tense, I would say. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
So far it's sounding great. It sounds like more of us could just get to Branson. We'll heal, especially with as generous and open a heart as you have. We will heal the political divide at this time. So were there moments, however, where you felt really uncomfortable when you're watching something that, especially, I think I might feel especially uncomfortable if something were presented to me as universal, but had a particular political agenda that I didn't agree with. Were there moments where you really felt, cognitive dissonance, and how did you respond to that?
I did, and it made me kind of more empathetic for everyone who might feel that way, right? Whenever they feel that their political value, they have to walk into a room and they worry that no one agrees with their political values. One of those moments was, when I went to the first couple of years, I went to Branson, the controversy over Colin Kaepernick was really strong still. So for those of you who don't remember, Colin Kaepernick was an NFL quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers. And during the 2016 NFL season, he began to kneel during the national anthem as a protest against police brutality and racial injustice. And at that time, I was teaching at WashU, and I was teaching about this moment as a really important form of embodied protest that has a long history back to kind of the Black Power Fist in 1968 of the Olympic athletes who were protesting against similar things in 1968, and how oftentimes in sports, it's a moment to for people to express their political opinions, and it has always been. And so I was teaching that in my class. I even had a student, I don't, he didn't overlap with Brett Carr, I don't think, but he ended up publishing an article about Colin Kaepernick's kneel as a form of embodied protest. And then in Branson, that was when these signs started to pop up everywhere that we stand for the flag and we kneel for the cross. And in one show, the final song was a rendition of Johnny Cash's That Ragged Old Flag. And the MC added a lyric, because does anyone know that song? It's kind of like a chant almost. Well, it talks about the history of the American flag and how it's been kind of battered and beaten and abused and been through all these wars, but it's still flying strong, right? And so we added a lyric at the end where he said, and it's a shame when people won't stand for her at a football game. And the whole crowd erupted into applause. And that was a moment of cognitive dissonance for me, because it was just very different from how I had been thinking about and experiencing that moment. Yeah.
My memories of Branson date back to growing up in the 60s, every time with the family, Silver Dollar City, Shepherd of the Hills, which goes back in the 1930s or so. And I remember the propaganda at the time, which I bought, was that when the book Shepherd of the Hills was written, it was like we're selling neck and neck with the Bible. It was like such a pro.
It's actually true, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And they had a passion, essentially, but not a passion, like they did their own pageant, which is still going, I believe. So I visited Branson many times over many years. It seemed to me that Branson kind of missed being a factor in the 1980s culture wars, because it wasn't what it became in the 90s. So now that it's caught up in this whole culture war moment now, I was in Branson most recently last spring, and it appears to me, having experienced it in that heyday you described, more like a dinosaur graveyard right now. And I feel like it's almost a perfect backdrop for, has America been made great again? Southwest Missouri has always been a bastion of conservatism for generations. But what's your take on what Branson looks like and represents today versus what it represented when Andy Williams was flying high?
Yeah, some people have called me too optimistic, but I just really believe in the power of live performance, and I do still think there are many performers there that are doing creative, interesting things and kind of trying to make the world a better place through performance and their vision and what they see fit. However, I will say that, there's also, in the 1990s, when the 60 Minutes came and all this national attention shown on Branson, and then you had these cultural critics writing pretty vicious things that made people in Branson kind of like retrench a little bit further defensively. Branson gained this reputation that then attracted more people who you might see are politically more on the fringe, so that you have people who really do kind of support a Christian nationalist point of view who have moved to Branson in the past 10 years and started, like Darren Myers, who started Freedom Journey Show, Kimberly Fletcher, who's a co-founder of Moms for America, which is one of the sponsors of the January 6th rally, relocated her headquarters from Texas to Branson because she said, people get it here. People understand what I'm trying to do. So I think, every place is always going to have a mix of people, but that reputation of Branson has been sort of self-reinforcing in one sense.
So I kind of wanted to go back to the economic.
Sure.
I mean, it just strikes me as, and you know more about this than me, so correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I feel like right now we're hearing a lot about like how Broadway isn't sustainable, that like it's so expensive to put on a Broadway show, and people are, that it's like, and it's similar to like a lot of the high arts, like orchestras and ballets are always like feeling that it's the end, but it seems like Broadway is at a particularly like acute moment right now. And so I'm curious if that's happening in Branson too, or if they've figured out, if they have like a different economic formula, or and clearly it sounds like workers are being exploited, and maybe more than Broadway, maybe more, I don't know. And so maybe that's one way that they're sort of like able to make profits, if they underpay people. But yeah, I'm just curious like how it's how you see it sustaining itself, and like what that might say also, like, is there something there of a model for the arts more broadly of like how we can make them economically sustainable, or I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's some aspects of Branson that are more sustainable than Broadway and that Broadway could learn from. One has been, honestly, kind of the community model, which, I mean, they wouldn't call it mutual aid, right? But like, there is a legacy of kind of businesses supporting each other, like from the stage, like, oh, go have dinner at Landry's, or like, if you go to Landry's, you get a 10% discount here. So there is certain levels of cooperation that have helped Branson sustain itself. And, trying to get the best quality production values, but not going over the top. So Broadway's become unsustainable because of like how the soaring costs of a production. Branson has kept things relatively low cost. So there are certain models there, and it's affordable. Well, it isn't affordable for the people, as I said, who are kind of like the concession stand workers, janitors, etc. But I will say that many of the performers, like the backup performers, found it way more like they could make a living there, which they couldn't in Los Angeles or New York. They could afford a 2-bedroom apartment. And, again, this is the flip side of non-unions. They could work 2 shows and make and then they could make a decent living. There were a couple who like ruined their vocal cords or things like that, but there is work opportunity to work. And I spoke to several, again, kind of backup performers who said like, I got opportunities here I would have never gotten anywhere else. So I'm not sure how well it can translate or not, but yeah, I think there's something in despite everyone being very like independent and like individual business owners, there has historically, sometimes it goes up and down. Like sometimes people fight and then they don't cooperate anymore and then they come back together. But the moments of kind of cooperation, I think helped make Branson sustainable for many years. Yeah, here and then back there.
The racial makeup. I remember not being attracted to Branson years ago, many years ago. Being from U City and loving diversity and having theater experiences with all different colored people and so forth. And I had the impression that Branson was wanting to be white only. And is that far from the truth? And what is it like now? And when you talk about the poor people who are kind of being exploited, are they all white or are they now?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, historically, the Ozarks were seen as a place that was kind of like the last stand of pure white Americans. It was talked about in, you know, folklorists and people who wrote books that, you know, this is the last place where you really have real down-to-earth rural Americans. There's also Appalachia, but those people have been exploited by, you know, mining interests and coal mining, and they're getting cancer from like all the coal mine dust. But, you know, there was this myth, I will say, that people in the Ozarks were more purely poor, right? You know, basically almost no one chooses to be poor. So that's why I say it was a myth. I think they would have welcomed economic opportunity. So there was kind of a racial aspect to what people valorized about the Ozarks area in the early part of the 20th century. But that shifted to more there were kind of colorblind ways of keeping those ideas alive. But Branson did diversify, especially in the 1990s when Charlie Pride came. And I talk in the book about this group called the Platters who came and are still in Branson. And I would say in the past 10 to 15 years, the Convention Visitors Bureau has made a much more concerted effort to market diversity, because it is at the end of the day like a family-friendly, affordable destination. And its kind of Christian orientation is an attraction across racial lines for a lot of people. And in particular, Sight and Sound is fascinating. This is the Bible-based musicals, because they do racially blind casting. And no one seems to be bothered by it, whereas, you know, you hear a lot of drama about that elsewhere. But, you know, like I went to see a production where Samson was Black and his father was white, and, you know, and it didn't seem to be a problem. So yeah, so it has diversified, and its labor pool also. Many more people from like Puerto Rico now work there, for example. Yeah. Oh yeah, back there.
Yeah, I'm gonna go way back now to the origins of Branson. There's a tale of two cities. One of them, Nashville, the other one, Branson. Both of those areas culturally, politically, early on, you're talking Carter family, Chet Atkins, that you go way back there. They were identical. They were the same size, politically, geographically, economically, they were the same. Why did Branson forego country music? And we know what happened to Nashville, who embraced it. What was in the water down in Branson? We thought, this country music ain't going anywhere. Nashville, those businessmen said, they call that the Nashville Sound. So what happened? Why did they desert? Now, Springfield, Missouri, early on, had their equivalent to the Grand Ole Opry. It was successful.
Yeah, the Ozark Jubilee.
There we go. The same kind of shows that was going on in Nashville. Nashville embraced it. For some reason, Branson said, no, they turned their nose. And a lot of the country music got started by Missourians. You watch Ken Burns' show about country music, he highlights it. There's Missourians down that area that promoted, went to Nashville, and were listening to Nashville. They got that country going. Anybody who's gone to Nashville today, Compare that to Branson today. You ain't talking apples and oranges, apples and lemons. No, you're talking gold mine versus change. So I was always curious, why does Branson, what was in the politics or whatever of that area that made them shun what made them gold to begin with? That's it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say that Branson didn't shun country music, but what Nashville had was a 30-year head start on the recording industry. And that's where you make the money, is you have recording studios and you sell records. What Branson specialized in was very important to the history of country music. It was the quote unquote hillbilly variety show. And that's what kept kind of the idea of authenticity of country music alive, right? Nashville, they might sing about being in a rural area, the solo artist, but in Branson, you saw a whole family singing about where they were from together on stage. And so, people in Branson, historically talked about this, how what they did supported what Nashville made money off of, right? But the recording industry never quite got off the ground in Branson. And so it kept going with kind of the live performances. And then in the 90s, diversified those live performances to attract more people. And that's when you have the magic shows. That's when you have Yakov Smirnoff, comedian, coming. That's when you have Vegas people coming. And many of them didn't work out, like Wayne Newton came and then he left again. So I don't necessarily think the strategy of diversifying what it offered was wrong. I just think that there was so much money to be made in the recording industry, and until the rise of Spotify, basically, that the wealth of Nashville eclipsed Branson. And it's also, despite being in a hilly southern mountain region that's seen as very similar to the Ozarks, it's much more, someone pointed out to me that one of Branson's rivals as a tourist destination is Pigeon Forge, which is within a day's drive of 2/3 of the nation's population, and Branson's within a day's drive of 1/3 of the nation's population. So there's also that proximity to New York City capital, right, and investment that makes a difference. Yeah.
You mentioned that one of the impetuses or inspirations for your book was that the question for what's wrong with Kansas, you felt like Branson was a good example of that being wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious after the last 7 years, whether you still feel that way or you feel like this is now an example of what's wrong with Branson.
Well, I would still say the thesis is wrong. I would still say that people, because I found his thesis kind of condescending. It said people are hoodwinked. They're stupid. They don't understand their own economic interests. And they are just voting with red meat cultural ideas. And in Branson, the people who are performing on stage say look, I built my own business and I made it and I could build it here because I didn't have any government red tape to stop me. And I can my whole family is here. My whole family can be employed in this theater. I think, where that starts to have problems is, there have been corporate ownership over a lot of the theaters in Branson now. They're at its height, Branson had 52 theaters. Now there's only 25. There's still just as many shows, but it's that these kind of corporate owners came in, and very few of the theaters are owned by families anymore. So I would say there's kind of cracks in that vision. That's how I feel. But I don't think it proved his thesis correct.
We have a question online.
Oh, sure.
Would you consider Branson an expression of an organic Ozark cultural trait or something that is more synthetic or amalgamated?
That's a great question. I would say that even an organic Ozarks cultural product is an amalgamation of lots of different American popular culture interests. So from the beginning, the earliest families in Branson who said, we are true Ozarks hillbillies, we do folk music that was born in these hills, They were playing songs from Smokey and the Bandit, right? And playing songs from movie soundtracks. They were playing, they were playing blues, right? They would play George, what's his name? White Lightning. The history of popular entertainment in America is one of variety and cultural mixing. And I tell this story in the book, but like when folklorists came down to the Ozarks in the 1920s, they were kind of like, wait, what are you doing? You're supposed to be singing on your front porch, and you're supposed to be singing white music, and you're supposed to be singing black music. Like, why are you singing Scott Joplin's ragtime songs, and why are you playing Beethoven? And the folklorists, I mean, this is a critique of American academics, right? Folklorists really worked to kind of separate and purify American folk music when people who were playing music in the South would play anything, and they would play Tin Pan Alley songs like written by Jewish composers, right? So I would say, yes, there are many shows that are organic Ozarkian shows that come from an already mixed American popular culture canon. Yeah.
7 years, that's crazy to me. How has this experience changed you as a educator, mother, neighbor, friend? Like what's different about you today than had I met you a day before you started this show?
Yeah, I think it really forced me to, it challenged me to say, am I really an open-minded person? Because many of us think we're open-minded, and then we're confronted with ideas that we might not agree with or believe in, and those people are happy and thriving, right? It's like, maybe, 7 years ago, I would have said like faith, family, and flag cannot be the foundation for an American dream, like full stop. And then when you talk to people and meet people who live by those values every day, and some people who like really genuinely stem their life from kind of like a love of Christ, and therefore, as one person I interviewed, not just being friendly to people, but like genuinely loving every person you meet. And he was very sincere. And so it really challenged me in my own perceptions of my own openness. and also just, I feel like I'm going to just keep kind of trying to be that way and really, really lead with curiosity rather than judgment. Well, I think we're at time, but I'm going to stick around. If you have more questions, sign books. I want to thank Will for being here with me, and thank Left Bank Books for having me.
Alrighty, y'all.